Okay, looks like we've got a few folk here today. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third and final Nightlight Astrology speaker series here for the winter. And today we have Timothy Desmond joining us. So just before I hand over to Timothy, I have a few things I just need to go over with you before we get started. So just to remind everybody that we are, as I say, in the third of our talks this season. Okay. So here's Timothy. Yesterday we had Stormy Grace join us, and you can still watch the replay of Stormy. That will be available for another 7 days. Raimundo's talk from last week, I believe, will be that will actually go off today. So if you do need to watch that one and haven't caught up with that, then please do. So you can do that there. Once Timothy has done his talk today, the same will happen for him, and you will get 7 days to watch the replay from this talk through the website here. Okay, so I just want to quickly introduce Timothy before I hand over to him, and we will go over where you can find him in the future once we get to the end of the talk. Timothy is going to be talking to us about near-death experience and string theory and astrology in the Platonic Jungian tradition. So there's a lot to go through today. So as I say, I don't want to spend too much time here introducing, because I'll let him do that himself. But Timothy is a professor at the College of Southern Maryland, where he has been teaching introductory classes in philosophy, ethics, and religion since 2013, and earned his PhD in philosophy and religion in 2014 with a concentration in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies. So he studied with Richard Tarnas, author of Cosmos and Psyche, who, as you know, at Nightlight, we love. So it's with great pleasure that I can introduce you, actually, Timothy, because I believe that this is going to be absolutely fascinating. There's a lot of people very excited to hear what you've got to say. So I am going to hand over to you. If you have any questions, just want to remind everybody that the Q&A box is at the bottom here. If you hover your mouse, you'll see the little box with the Q&A. That's where all the questions are going, please. Timothy will maybe, as we go through, answer some of the questions, but certainly we'll get to them at the end of the session. Okay, so I will hand over to you, Timothy. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me share the screen here. Share. All right, so can you see that screen? Let me turn this.
Yes, that's full screen.
All right, well, so this class is going to be, the title is Near-Death Experiences, String Theory, and Astrology in the Platonic Jungian Tradition. So let me so the class is based on an article I wrote for the Archai Journal. This was back in 2012. Death, Rebirth, and the Revolution, Archetypal Dynamics and Personal Experience. And I'm gonna move my face over there. My article is Raising Plato's Curriculum from the Dead, the Myth of in the Light of Susskind String Theory, Tarnas's Archetypal Astrology, and Jung's Near-Death Experience of the Cosmic Horizon. So this that was in 2012. In 2018, I published the book Psyche and Singularity. This was based off of my dissertation, which I got at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I'm proudly citing this quote here from Sean Kelly, who was the chair of my dissertation committee. He's a professor at CIIS. And he very generously said, the most original and important contribution to the integration of Jungian psychology and physics since the original collaboration between Jung and Pauli. So Wolfgang Pauli was one of the co-founders of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics or quantum mechanics in 1927. And he worked with Jung for the last 25 years of his life, trying to find parallels between physics and psychology. And that's an idea that Plato originated in the Republic, as we'll see. So the raising Plato's curriculum from the dead, I'm going to explain how the emergence of Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory, I call it holographic because he applied the holographic principle to string theory to explain black holes and whether or not black holes swallow information. If something falls into a black hole, is it erased from the universe, like Stephen Hawking said? And Leonard Susskind says, it is from one perspective if you go through that black hole with that information, but if you watch from outside, it gets smeared out around the event horizon and released with the Hawking radiation. And the universe, he says, is an inside-out black hole, so that the information of the entire universe is conserved at the outermost sphere called the cosmic horizon, and it radiates back in from there with the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation on these elastic strings of energy to create this three-dimensional world, which Susskind calls a cinematic hologram. So that's the big picture that we're going to be paying attention to, because I'm saying all of the planets and all of our psyches are merged at each point of this encompassing sphere, which is something Plato also said. Now, Leonard Susskind, an atheist trying to disprove theories of intelligent design, accidentally stumbled upon Plato's ancient cosmology, and that provides a platform for synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, including astrological synchronicities, meaningful coincidences between our lives on Earth, the archetypal tenor of our lives on Earth, and the positions of the planets. Every bit of information of the whole universe is located out at that horizon, and it shines back in with the echo of the Big Bang. And I'm going to explain how that creates a reasonable explanation for synchronicities in general and astrological synchronicities in particular. And by studying these synchronicities, you can gradually open the eye of the soul to the infinitely brilliant idea of the good, which I equate with the central singularity and the encompassing horizon of the universe. So I know that's a lot of information. I just wanted to give the big overall picture, and then we're going to get into the details. So raising Plato's curriculum from the dead, I'm just going to quickly read here. This is from the article. This is an introduction that's in the essay itself, and I've got to move my little picture around here. So raising Plato's curriculum from the dead. In the myth of at the end of book 10 of Plato's Republic, Socrates ties together an account of a near-death experience, a rudimentary string theory of information conservation at the cosmic horizon, and allusions to astrology. This professor, Dr. Waterfield, is the one who makes that connection between the myth of which is a near-death experience of a soldier named and astrology. He says Plato was using language that was meant to point to astrology. So continuing, that Plato chose to conclude what became his most famous dialogue with precisely that combination of seemingly disparate topics suggests a profound connection between them. So near-death experiences, string theory, and astrology. This confluence furthermore renders it plausible to claim that Plato intended a study of those same topics to complete the curriculum for the philosopher king, which Socrates describes earlier in the Republic in Book 7. In this article, I assemble evidence to support the following theory: a synthesis of Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory, Richard Tarnas's archetypal astrology, and Carl Jung's transpersonal psychology sheds new light on the myth of in a way that reveals a covert curriculum in Book 7, thereby rendering it teachable today. So the myth of is the end of Plato's Republic, where he has Socrates talking to some young men about the ideal city, the ideally just city. And the majority of that dialogue is spent discussing how to educate the future rulers of this ideally just society. But at the very end, he tells the story of a soldier named who woke up on his own funeral pyre days after he had apparently died, although his body wasn't decaying. And he recalled his journey to the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where he saw the three fates, the three sisters who represent past, present, and future, dealing with the threads of destiny of each reincarnating psyche's soul out at the horizon of the cosmos. So I draw this correlation with holographic string theory, but the real parallel that's even closer is Carl Jung's near-death experience which we'll be talking about, that he had in 1944, and I'll read his description of it. The way Carl Jung describes his journey, his out-of-body experience to the horizon of the cosmos, is a real close point-for-point parallel with the way Leonard Susskind describes the horizon of the cosmos. All right, so here's the book that was based on my dissertation, and this is something that Richard Tarnas. This is Richard Tarnas's book. I guess we just went over my book. So, Cosmos and Psyche: Intimations of a New Worldview. And here's something that Richard Tarnas says on page 85. He says, the astrological thesis as developed within the Platonic Jungian lineage. So it was this book. I had his original book, The Passion of the Western Mind, which was a great resource for me since 1993. And I had my book bag stolen out of my car when I was moving one day back in 2007, and I went to get another copy of The Passion of the Western Mind, and in the bookstore they had this book displayed, which I would have never looked into astrology. It wasn't that I didn't believe in astrology, I just didn't have an interest in studying it. I actually thought it was maybe a dead science, that it was legitimate, but the people who were doing it didn't know what they were talking about. But when I saw Rick Tarnas had just put out a book about it, I figured, well, this will be worth reading. So I bought the book, read it, and within about 6 months or so, I started noticing the correlations that he said to look out for during certain alignments, and then quickly became convinced, and I've been studying astrology ever since. So when he talks about the Platonic Jungian lineage, here is a quote from Carl Jung. Archetype is an explanatory paraphrase of the Platonic eidos, or the absolute ideas. So Jung went through phases of his philosophy, but his final phase, when he was working with Pauli, he was more or less a Platonist. And he identified the archetypes of the collective unconscious with what Plato called the ideas, the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul. And as we'll see, Jung and Plato's description of the soul leads us, it makes it pretty easy to correlate it with the central singularity described by string theory, which combines general relativity, the theory of gravity, and quantum mechanics. So when you look at the parallels between Jung and Plato's description of the self, including the universal self in whom we all participate, there's a close mirror symmetry with the central singularity and the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. That's the theme that we'll be going over again and again. But archetypes of the collective unconscious is what Carl Jung talked about, and he said that's more or less the same as the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul that Plato talked about. So here's the source that I am using solely for astrology. So here is Leonard Suskind's two books, The Black Hole, well, actually the Cosmic Landscape, String Theory, and the Illusion of Intelligent Design came first. That was 2006. And then The Black Hole War, My Battle with Stephen Hawking to Make the World Safe for Quantum Mechanics. So he had this ongoing battle with Stephen Hawking. So there was a conference in Santa Barbara in June of 1993. And in that conference, Stephen Hawking pointed out that if anything falls through the event horizon of a black hole, where the fabric of space-time is contracting at the speed of light beyond the event horizon, the spherical border surrounding the central singularity, beyond that event horizon, space-time is contracting toward that central point of infinite density faster than light, so that not even light can escape. And what Stephen Hawking was pointing out is, with Hawking radiation, which is a topic that we'll get into, the black hole it shrinks smaller and smaller. It eventually disappears, and all that information that was in it is lost from the universe, which seems to violate what Susskind calls the most fundamental physical principle of information conservation. So the mass and the energy stay equivalent, according to Hawking, because of this Hawking radiation. But the Hawking radiation that apparently is coming out of the black hole, it isn't really coming out of the black hole, it's coming from the underlying quantum vacuum, So although the energy stays constant, the information that went into that black hole is not released. So for example, information conservation is if you had a bomb and you blew it up, all the fragments of metal and gas are chaotically distributed into space and time. But if you had a computer powerful enough to track each atom, you could reassemble it. All that information is still there. Hawking was saying, not if it's past the event horizon of a black hole, then it is gone. If a bomb blew up right near a black hole and all of that explosion got sucked into the black hole, you'd never be able to reassemble that bomb. You wouldn't be able to track down the information that describes the trajectory of every atom. That really put a bee in Leonard Susskind's bonnet. He couldn't sleep. He was going mad. And that was all of the psychological arrangements for what Carl Jung said would induce the ultimate archetype of the collective unconscious, the self archetype, to compensate a mind split between opposing demands, like Leonard Suskind's was. Carl Jung, as we'll see, said his biggest discovery in his life was that the self archetype, which Plato called the idea of the good, compensates an ego that is pulled between opposing demands by presenting it with images of mandalas, a circle or sphere with a central point. And a black hole, we'll see, is a geometrically perfect mandala, a central singularity, which is literally a mathematical point that's outside of space and time, surrounded by a perfect two-dimensional, perfectly thin sphere, which is the event horizon, which is only in existence from certain perspectives, and from other perspectives, it's not. And that's called black hole complementarity. We'll get into it. And another big point to keep in mind that I'll reiterate throughout this class is that according to Susskind, the universe is an inside-out black hole, expanding from a singularity at the Big Bang instead of contracting into one. And where space-time is expanding at the speed of light, that's called the cosmic horizon, or the horizon of the cosmos. It's an inside-out black hole. That's where all the information from the past, present, and future of the entire universe is located at each point, as if on a holographic film. That is how Susskind ultimately saved the principle of information conservation, and it enabled him to combine the long opposed theories of general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, and quantum mechanics, the theory of the very small. So the theory of the very big and the theory of the very small do not work together mathematically. But a singularity in a black hole requires both, because it's got infinite gravity, so it needs general relativity, and yet it's infinitesimally small. It has no extension in space. So something that small requires quantum mechanics, and that was a big problem because those two languages don't work together. So Susskind and his partner Gerard 't Hooft, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, worked together to create this holographic version of string theory. And another big point to keep in mind that we'll be going over is that these strings that they theorize are too small to see. They're at the Planck scale, 10 to the negative 33 centimeters. We don't have the technology capable of seeing something that small. The metaphor uses is you would need an atomic accelerator the size of the galaxy and 1 trillion barrels of oil a second to fuel a microscope powerful enough to see something down at that scale. So a lot of critics say, well, then it's not science. It's not empirical science. If you can't observe it, it isn't real. And that's a big point that I'll be getting into, because Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, following Plato, theorized that the laws of physics and the laws of psychology should mirror each other, should parallel each other, because mind and matter both emerge from the same transcendental source, the self archetype, which they also call the unus mundus and the one, and the God archetype, which Plato called the idea of the good. Well, when we see the parallels between, especially between Carl Jung's near-death experience and Suskind's string theory, then their prediction of a mirror symmetry between physics and psychology came resoundingly true. And I suggest that that is a form of empirical evidence. One form of empirical evidence is Carl Jung's own eyewitness account of the horizon of the cosmos. Even though he was out of his body, he claimed to have perceived it with his psyche. And another form of empirical verification is that he wrote down this prediction and he described his near-death experience, as well as his theories about mandalas and his psychological theories generally, but especially his near-death experience. He wrote that down. Susskind wrote down his version of the horizon of the cosmos, and you can see empirically that they parallel each other, which fulfills that prediction that this top-notch physicist and this top-notch psychologist, Jung and Pauli, made together. So I'm suggesting that string theory provides a mechanism to describe and explain how astrology works, or synchronicities in general. And synchronicities, and especially astrological synchronicities and near-death experiences provide empirical evidence which string theory lacks. So that's the symbiotic relationship. And the irony is that Leonard Susskind is an atheist. And he presents his theory as the way to get out of believing in an intelligent designer. And I'll touch on that here, and I'll mention it again later. He says all of the constants of nature, like especially the cosmological constant, which describes the expansion rate of space-time, but also the speed of light, and all of these fundamental ordering principles of the universe need to be exactly what they are in order for biological life to exist. They need to be so finely tuned that it is impossible to reasonably believe that it just randomly appeared without some intelligent designer, unless there's an infinite, or at least a close to infinite, whatever that means. 10 to the power of 500 is the number he uses to represent close to infinite. If there's that many parallel universes, then the odd chance that some of them, some tiny percentage of them, will have all of these physical parameters just so finely tuned for life to emerge becomes inevitable. So what seems like this miracle of intelligent design, which he admits it does appear like that, becomes less miraculous in light of the multiverse theory, which string theory forces on him. He didn't create a multiverse theory to explain away the illusion of intelligent design, but the multiverse that emerged from his mathematics does provide a way to explain that without appealing to God. Okay, so now I'm going to read through the basics of Susskind's holographic string theory, and I mentioned some of them before. I'm going to go over them again, and then after that, I think I will just stop briefly to see if there's any questions, because this is where it's going to get really complicated, and we need to get these basics down so that we can understand how this string theory is mirrored by, or mirrors, psychology, especially near-death experiences. Okay, so Susskind's holographic string theory: fundamental strings are at the Planck scale, too small to detect. I talked about that. So for string theory, the quantum particles like photons and electrons and the quarks, any quantum particle is actually a much, much smaller and elastic string of energy. And the way that these strings create particles is that they wrap around compactified dimensions of space. So for string theory, there's 3 spatial dimensions that we live in, and it's not that we can perceive the 3 dimensions of space, because space itself is empirically unobservable. You can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear space. But the things we can observe with our 5 sense organs appear to exist in 3 dimensions of space from our human perspective. But Susskind says that down at this Planck scale, this tiniest scale, there are, he says, another 6 dimensions of space. Others have said 7, and there's different versions of how many wrapped up dimensions of space there are at each point of 3-dimensional space, but they're wrapped around these geometrical shapes called Calabi-Yau manifolds. And the geometry of those extra-dimensional objects, with the strings wrapping around them and vibrating, that's what creates what we perceive as particles. So it's the geometry of the compactified dimensions of space-time with these elastic strings wrapping around them, vibrating, that accounts for the zoo of quantum particles, which was Michio Kaku's explanation. So the holographic principle, I mentioned this briefly. We're going to go over this again. The whole black hole war with Stephen Hawking was about, is information lost inside a black hole, which would violate, Susskind realized, the fundamental principle of information conservation. And here's the way he described it. And to understand it, you need to appeal to his other principle, black hole complementarity. So black hole war with Stephen Hawking over information conservation. So according to Susskind, if you were watching from outside a black hole, something fall towards the black hole, like a spaceship, as it approached the event horizon, it would get smeared out all around that spherical border where the fabric of spacetime is contracting toward the central singularity. It would get smeared out and scrambled. It would never fall past the event horizon from your perspective, looking from outside a black hole. And then gradually over time, the little bits of information recorded on this event horizon would leak back out into the observable universe with the Hawking radiation. So I'll describe what that is. This is why I'm going to take questions after we get to the bottom of this slide. So Stephen Hawking realized that according to quantum physics, down at the smallest scale of things, there's what they call the quantum vacuum, which quantum physicists have proven exists, or at least provided very powerful evidence suggesting that it exists, empirical evidence, with these two slides that they put very close together, and they were pushed all the way together in this experiment back in 1947. Virtual particle-antiparticle pairs are constantly emerging from this quantum vacuum and then recombining and annihilating each other. A photon and an antiphoton from this virtual state in this underlying quantum vacuum, they emerge, then they immediately recombine and annihilate each other. And that energy from the annihilation of these virtual particle-antiparticle pairs is what they call dark energy, and that's what causes the expansion of space-time. And the rate of the expansion of space-time has to be so perfectly fine-tuned the way it is, or life, biological life, couldn't exist. So Susskind used Hawking's own theory of Hawking radiation to explain how this information is saved. The information gets smeared out around the event horizon according to string theory. The fundamental strings of which each particle are made get smeared out around the event horizon, and then Hawking radiation occurs when a virtual particle-antiparticle pair appears right on that razor's edge of the event horizon. The antiparticle gets sucked in, and the virtual real particle, or there's a virtual particle and a virtual antiparticle. The virtual antiparticle gets sucked into the black hole, and the positive side of that pole escapes from its antiparticle pair. Rather than being annihilated, the event horizon separates them, and when that virtual particle becomes a real particle, it carries out with it, like a letter carrier, which is the metaphor that Susskind uses, one of those bits of information that was stored on the event horizon. That is how information is saved. Information is saved. However, from another perspective, if you were in that spaceship and you went past that event horizon, you wouldn't notice anything strange at the event horizon, although you would never be able to escape because of the fabric of space-time. The tidal flow of space-time has surpassed the speed of light, and no physical object can travel faster than light, something Einstein demonstrated in special relativity in 1905. So you would ultimately get sucked into the singularity and be destroyed. That's black hole complementarity. From one perspective, the information is smeared out around the event horizon and released with the Hawking radiation. From another perspective, the perspective of something going past the event horizon, the information is destroyed and lost from the universe, just as Stephen Hawking thought. Okay, so cosmic complementarity. And again, when I get to the bottom of this screen, we'll stop and take a few questions just to clarify the fundamentals. And I got to keep a track of the time here. So cosmic complementarity is the inside-out version of black hole complementarity. So the singularity, which is defined as a point of infinite gravity with zero extension in space, inside a black hole, it causes space-time to contract towards it. At the Big Bang, and this was something else Stephen Hawking did, he said, oh, look at this model of Roger Penrose, my classmate here at Oxford. He's just created this interesting model of a black hole. What if I turn that time dimension and reverse it, and now it becomes a model of the Big Bang? And that's what he did for his PhD. And so what Susskind says is all of the information that recedes past the horizon of the cosmos, where the expansion rate of space-time surpasses the speed of light. So space-time is expanding at an accelerating rate. And when it surpasses the speed of light, anything that goes past the horizon of the cosmos, from our perspective on Earth, will never get back into the universe, because nothing can travel faster than that faster than light expansion of space-time. However, if you were watching from Earth through a telescope that was powerful enough, you would see all the information that's approaching the horizon of the cosmos smeared out around the enormous sphere, the horizon of the cosmos, which is infinitely hot, and it would radiate back in with the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang, on these fundamental elastic strings, which create the cinematic hologram, the holographic movie of three-dimensional space. So we live in a holographic movie. The film on which the movie is recorded is out at the horizon of the cosmos, and all of the information from the past, present, and future of the entire universe is located at each point of this encompassing sphere, which means each point is itself a singularity. So we exist in a more real sense at the horizon of the cosmos. And this three-dimensional form of ours unfolding over time is an illusion. An illusion is real, but it's not understood properly. We live in a three-dimensional world, but it's illusory unless we understand that it's being projected first out from the central singularity and then back in from the horizon of the cosmos. We'll see that this is very close to Plato's cave allegory. It's very close to Carl Jung's near-death experience, and it gives a explanation for how synchronicities work. So multiverse of bubble universes, I went over that. According to string theory, there's innumerable parallel universes. One way to describe it, Hugh Everett III in 1957 described it through quantum physics, and Susskind says his description is equivalent to the string theory description. In quantum physics, everything is a wave of probability until it is observed. And Hugh Everett III said, well, what happens to all those points in that wave of probability that don't collapse into a particle? What happens to them? They just never got to exist. The mathematics says that it's just as accurate to say that each of those potential points in a wave of probability that didn't collapse in this universe, they do manifest in parallel universes. The only difference between one universe and its neighbor is that position of that one particle, so that if you extrapolate outward, every conceivable scenario in history, every conceivable combination of atoms occurs in one universe or another. This is a fascinating, philosophically fascinating theory, but the mathematics forces itself on to the physicist, says Susskind, and as I explained, he uses that to explain away what he calls the illusion of intelligent design, for how all the parameters of physics need to be so perfectly fine-tuned for life to exist, because there's an infinite number of parallel universes with every conceivable scenario occurring. Some of them inevitably will have the parameters for life there. So there's, in a nutshell, Susskind string theory, and we're going to see how it is mirrored by Platonic and Jungian descriptions of the soul. But I'm going to stop here briefly just to see if there's any outstanding questions.
There are some questions, Timothy, so I'll read them. Let me know if you want to answer them or if you want to move on.
Okay.
Okay, so Christina is asking, could a near-death experience be a visit to one of our other parallel dimensions?
I would say that a near-death experience is a visit to the source of all of the dimensions that manifest in the empirically visible world. I'm equating the horizon of the cosmos and the central singularity with the idea of the good, or the self archetype, or the God archetype, and that each of us, I'm saying, participates in that archetype. And I identify that archetype with the central singularity and the encompassing holographic horizon of the cosmos. As we'll see, I'm saying the self archetype, the natural image of which is a mandala, a sphere with a central point, is the central singularity in the horizon, and I equate the conscious ego pole of the self with the central singularity, and I equate the collective unconscious pole of the archetype of the self with this horizon of the cosmos, where all of the archetypes of the collective unconscious are superimposed at each point. So when you have a near-death experience, I think you're experiencing the border between the spiritual world and the material world. Not so much that you're going to another material dimension. And the way that Susskind describes these extra dimensions is that they exist here at every point of three-dimensional space, but they're wrapped up in such a small shape that we don't perceive them. So I hope that answered that question.
Thank you. Amy is asking, are you saying that information is never really lost, it's just recycled out?
Yes, that is what Susskind is saying, that it's never lost. You can always reconstruct an event theoretically. If you had the technology capable of searching down the trajectory of any particle that ever existed, it always exists and it's never lost.
James is asking, what is a virtual particle?
A virtual particle is something that exists at the underlying quantum vacuum. So we talked about the Planck scale, which is this extremely small limit of the physical world that Maxwell Planck discovered. I believe it was 1901. So at that scale, it's a bubbling cauldron of virtual particle antiparticle pairs. I don't know how they figured that out, but they did. So a virtual particle antiparticle pair is a particle that never makes it out of the quantum vacuum. It emerges and then they recombine and annihilate each other, the particle and the antiparticle. And it's that collision that creates the energy that causes the expansion of space-time. At the event horizon of a black hole, the antiparticle gets sucked into the black hole and the virtual particle escapes as a real particle. So that's what a virtual particle is. I mean, that's the limit of my understanding of it anyway.
Stephanie is asking, have you ever considered sourcing Vedic texts for the historical literature which parallels these theories?
Yes, I do. I do in the book, Psyche and Singularity. I make a big point of that. The Platonic and the Vedic cosmologies are very similar. For Plato, especially in the Timaeus, he has the astronomer Timaeus talking to Socrates and explaining that the soul of the universe exists literally at the central point and at each point of this encompassing sphere, which he calls the mother substance, and that all of the material forms radiate in from that mother substance. In the Vedic literature, it's a Vishnu form in the center of every bubble universe. All of the universes, which are like these little bubbles, radiate from Mahavishnu's, the pores of Mahavishnu's skins. In the center of every bubble universe is another Vishnu incarnation, Garbhodakashayi Vishnu. And in the center of every particle in every bubble universe is another Vishnu, Kshirodakashayi Vishnu, also known as Paramatma. So yeah, I make a big point of pointing out how Platonic cosmology, Vedic cosmology, and holographic string theory all mirror each other, which fulfills Jung and Pauli's prediction and Plato's prediction in the Republic that we're going to go over. So I'll take one more question here so that I can continue because we've got a long way to go.
Okay, Paul's asking, you knew that there was going to be a Star Trek thing, yeah? Wasn't something like this mirroring concept used in the Next Generation Star Trek episode where they kept running into their own ship on the edge of a singularity?
I didn't see that one. I've seen a lot of episodes, but I didn't see that one. But I'm sure that's where they're getting it from. All of these theories. Hugh Everett III, I said, in 1957 was the first one to give a mathematically rigorous description of a multiverse, as far as I know. But it was in the early 1990s that these string theory versions of the multiverse were coming out. And I know that the next generation, I believe, was started in the early 90s. So that's probably what they were referring to. All right, well, let me continue here because we got a lot to go over. I know that this is complex, but we'll be going over these basics again and again. So let me just keep going here. Okay, so I'm going to read this just because the holographic principle is so fundamental, and people might think, oh, this, you're wishfully reading into something here that's not really there, but it really is. So here's what Leonard Susskind, an atheist who believes that this principle is refuting the need for appeals to intelligent design. Here's a quote. Here's what he says. The holographic principle is a shocking departure from what we have been accustomed to in the past. That information is distributed throughout the volume of space seems so intuitive that it's hard to believe that it could be wrong. I'll use this cursor here, but the world is not voxelated, meaning in these three-dimensional cubes of information. It is pixelated, which is two-dimensional squares of information. And all information is stored on the boundary of space. Now, here's an important point that I didn't mention earlier. But what boundary and what space? As we try to be more and more exact, especially when we account for both gravity and quantum mechanics, that's general relativity and quantum mechanics, we are driven to a mathematical representation involving patterns of pixels dancing across a distant two-dimensional screen. That's the horizon of the cosmos, ultimately, and a secret code for translating the scrambled patterns into coherent three-dimensional images. But of course, there is no screen covered with pixels surrounding every region of space. Grant's coffin is part of Grant's tomb, which is part of the solar system, which is contained in a galactic sphere surrounding the Milky Way until the entire universe is surrounded. At each level, everything enclosed may be described as a holographic image, but when we go looking for the hologram, it's always out at the next level. So that's a very important part of the holographic principle. The holographic principle says that any information in any three-dimensional volume of space can be described by the two-dimensional surface area, that they're equivalent descriptions, that all of the information in any 3D space also exists at each point of its two-dimensional surface area. So I'm in this room here, and this is a metaphor, not a metaphor, this is an example that Susskind used. He was talking about, he was in his office writing, and his cat was there, and his computer. All that information is there in the three dimensions of space. It also exists at each point of the wall, the floor, and the ceiling, and that it's radiating in from that two-dimensional surface area. There's powerful supporting evidence for that in near-death experiences, when at first people say, oh, I was looking down at my body from the ceiling. Carl Jung even mentions one of his patients who had a near-death experience while she was giving birth, or was during a cesarean birth. She said it looked like I was looking down from the ceiling. My eyes were in the ceiling. So I've personally had friends who have had that same experience. It's as if you're in the ceiling, or I've heard one of my friends was in a coma, and I've heard others describe it in the ceiling and the walls, the panoramic view, looking down at your dead body. But if you go out to find that information at the two-dimensional surface area of your room, it will recede to the next concentric boundary, which would be the atmosphere of Earth, which is where Carl Jung said he ended up during his near-death experience, looking down at the curvature of Earth and the reddish sands of Arabia, and then he had a vision of the horizon of the cosmos. So if you go out to the atmosphere of Earth, then the information recedes to the halo of the solar system, and then the galactic halo, and ultimately out to the horizon of the cosmos. Okay, so the holographic principle, very important for what we're going to be discussing, and how it's related to not only near-death experiences, but astrology. So cosmic horizon equals staging ground for synchronicity. Astrology is the study of meaningful coincidences between the archetypal tenor of life on Earth and the positions of the planets. So meaning-perceiving minds and empirically observable world, when they seem to be symbolically correlated, that's a synchronicity. That's Carl Jung coined that term, or he repurposed that term synchronicity. And he worked with Wolfgang Pauli to find a physical explanation for it. And I'm saying holographic string theory provides that. So we've all had synchronicities. You can, well, I'll just use Carl Jung's example rather than delve into my own personal example. I'm sure everyone listening here has got their own personal examples, but the scarab beetle example, he said he was talking to a patient and she was trapped in her Cartesian worldview, this dualistic worldview where there's the thinking world is totally separate from the material world. The material world is a soulless object to be observed. She was following this tradition of Rene Descartes, and it was causing her neurosis. And then she was telling Jung a dream she had about this costly piece of jewelry, a golden scarab beetle pendant of some kind. And then as she's describing it, he hears tapping on the window, something, and he goes and he looks, and it's this beetle, not a scarab beetle, but a beetle that resembled a scarab beetle, that it wasn't normally seen in that part of Switzerland. And it was trying to get into a dark room, which is counter to the usual inclination of insects to go towards light away from darkness. So he opened the window, grabbed the beetle, and handed it to her and said, "Here's your scarab beetle." So it seemed that the universe was communicating to this woman and synchronizing her telling of the story of her dream with an actual natural occurrence from this citizen of the natural world. That's a synchronicity. Well, how do you explain that? How is it that the universe can seem to poetically produce physical events that symbolically communicate to us? How is that possible? So continuing here, synchronicities are meaningful coincidences indicate a union of meaning perceiving minds in the material world, but where exactly do mind and matter meet? The synthesis of Platonic Jungian psychology and Suskind's holographic string theory provides the perfect mechanism to account for synchronicities in general and astrological synchronicities in particular. I say astrological synchronicities in particular because they have to do with our meaning perceiving minds on Earth and all of the planets in our solar system. According to string theory, all of the information describing all of the planets in our solar system and all of the people on Earth, as well as all of the other galaxies, all of that information is recorded at each point of the horizon of the cosmos, which exists from our geocentric perspective on Earth out at this outermost sphere where space-time is expanding away from us, from our perspective, at the speed of light. If you were on a planet out at what we perceive to be the infinitely hot horizon of the cosmos, you would see yourself in this as the center of an expanding universe, and us on Earth out at this infinitely hot horizon. That's called cosmic complementarity. So the last bit of this slide is Suskind's holographic string theory provides a cosmic mechanism to explain astrology and near-death experiences, which in turn provide empirical evidence for Suskind's string theory, which I mentioned before. So let me just keep going here. Here's a letter that Carl Jung wrote a year and a half before he died to A.D. Cornell on February 9th, 1960. Year and a half before he died, Jung identified two kinds of research that may provide empirical evidence for his synchronicity theory: astrology and near-death experiences. The myth of combines both, as I've said before. So here's the quote he wrote in this letter. "Two roads for further investigation exist," and he's talking about synchronicity. "One, experiment, and two, the study of case material. Under certain conditions, it is possible to experiment with archetypes, as my astrological experiment has shown." And then he goes on to say the other second way to study and gain information about synchronicities is the study of case material. He's talking about near-death experiences. He says this would require the observation of individual cases of death, severe illness, and serious accidents. So if you have a serious accident, sometimes people say my whole life flashed before my eyes, and they mean that literally, and there's an explanation for how that could happen. Holographic string theory provides a good explanation for that. But here are the two paths to provide empirical evidence for synchronicity. String theory, again, has no empirical evidence because we can't see these fundamental strings. They're too small. We can't detect these extra dimensions. They're compactified down at that smallest of scales. And we can't see the universes outside of our own because no light which would reveal their existence can get back into our universe past the horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding away from our perspective faster than light. But if you study astrology, you can see the planets and where they are. And you can look at the collected information from astrologers over the centuries that tells you what to predict, what kind of meaningful events will happen most likely when these planets go into certain geometrical relations in relationship to a central Earth. Saturn and Pluto, for example. Saturn is this dark and heavy archetype. Pluto is this archetype of intensity and death and resurrection. When they get together, certain typical events will occur, like plagues, like we saw back in the COVID pandemic, and war. What I'll be showing at the end of this series is that a black hole is the perfect example of the archetype of Saturn and Pluto. Tarnas calls Saturn the spirit of gravity, quoting Friedrich Nietzsche. And he says when Pluto and Saturn get together, that spirit of gravity gets intensified to titanic proportions. Well, I say a black hole is the archetype of Saturn and Pluto. Not an example of it. It is itself the archetype because it's not a material thing and it's a point of infinite gravity, infinite constriction, infinite darkness, infinite downward vector. So according to Tarnas's theory of astrology, when these hard alignments, the squares, the oppositions, and the conjunctions of Saturn and Pluto relative to the central Earth, when they come around, according to his theory, we should expect black hole science to reach certain milestones. And I'll show that they do that. And that's an empirical experiment. Oh, astrology is real? What kind of an empirical observation could I conduct to demonstrate that? Well, if it's real, Saturn and Pluto, they get together, that indicates black hole science correlates archetypally with those astrological, astronomical events. Do they? Well, you can go back and look in history and see. And I show examples where they do demonstrate that there is this correlation, which is empirical evidence for the existence of synchronicities, which is itself empirical evidence for the existence of archetypes or absolute ideas, which is itself evidence, according to Plato, for the existence of a soul or a psyche. Okay, so I keep looking at my clock because I know we got a lot of information here. Here's Carl Jung's near-death experience. So this, I first saw Leonard Susskind describe holographic string theory on July 4th, 2010, when I was out in California getting the PhD degree at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I was working on a paper and the TV was on in the background and he described it on an episode of Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman. I believe it was the second episode. And it was about black holes. And he described what I have already described to you. Well, when I heard it, I immediately remembered this near-death experience, which I had just read that summer for a class with Sean Kelly at the CIIS, and Memories, Dreams, Reflections. This is Carl Jung's autobiography. Here's him describing, he had a heart attack in 1944. He broke his foot, then he had a heart attack. While he was in the hospital, he had a heart attack and his psyche left his body. He said he rose above the hospital, then he rose above the earth about 1,000 miles up. He said it seemed to him later. As I mentioned before, he mentioned the reddish sands of Arabia. He could look down and see the clouds and the curvature of the earth. And then he said he encountered a huge hollowed out black boulder, like the temples he had seen in Bengal when he visited India on the shore of the Gulf of Bengal, whatever, was it the Bay of Bengal? At any rate, they hollowed out these big boulders on the beach and made them into temples. Well, he saw one of those floating 1,000 miles above the earth. In a brightly lit antechamber was this black Hindu in a white robe sitting in a lotus posture. Jung said, I knew that he was waiting for me. I knew that if I could go into that black rock temple, I would meet there in the back all the people to whom I belong in reality. But as he approached it, his whole life was stripped from him and then given back to him all at once. So he lived his whole life simultaneously. But then he saw a psychic image of his doctor, Dr. H, rise up from the earth and say, the earth has need of you, or something to that effect. You can't leave yet. The earth needs you. And then he woke up and he was sorely disappointed because when he did come out of his near-death experience, he said, and here's the quote, and you'll see how closely this parallels Susskind string theory. He said, "It seemed to me as if behind the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world had been artificially built up in which each person sat by himself in a little box. I had been so glad to shed it all, and now it had come about that I, along with everyone else, would again be hung up in a box by a thread." Now that right there is the best piece of evidence for a correlation, a mirror symmetry with holographic string theory, because each cubic volume of the interior of the universe is projected by a thread from the horizon of the cosmos. He's using this actual language, the horizon of the cosmos, this box-like system of voxelated information, which is a word that Susskind uses. The real information is pixelated out at the horizon of the cosmos, where the past, the present, and the future exist at each point, and it radiates in on these strings. This seems to be a dead ringer for Carl Jung's near-death experience. So continuing, he says, "It was not a product of imagination. The visions and experiences were utterly real. There was nothing subjective about them. They all had a quality of absolute objectivity. We shy away from the word eternal, but I can describe the experience only as the ecstasy of a non-temporal state in which the present, past, and future are one. One is interwoven into an indescribable whole and yet observes it with complete objectivity." So how can you have complete objectivity? Everyone's got a subjective point of view. I'm seeing the world from my particular point in space and time, right here and now, given my history as I've evolved through 3 dimensions of space along a timeline. How can you have an objective perspective? You would have to be able to see things from every point of space-time simultaneously to have an objective perspective, and that's exactly the perspective he said he had when his psyche rose out of his body. Okay, so I was watching this documentary about Susskind string theory and Through the Wormhole, and I recall this near-death experience. That became my dissertation in the book, and that's why I'm talking to you here now. This was that aha moment, and I'm still fascinated by it every time I think about it. So I just want to quickly go over this. I'm throwing this in there. Something that most people don't think about is that the past, the present, and the future coexist. This was something Einstein demonstrated in 1905. So 120 years ago, this was established, and it has huge philosophical implications for questions like determinism versus free will. So here's what Brian Greene, the famous string theorist, says in a documentary, The Fabric of the Cosmos, The Illusion of Time. "Once we know that your now can be what I consider the past, or your now can be what I consider the future, and your now is every bit as valid as my now, then we learn that the past must be real, the future must be real, they could be your now." So depending on how fast you're moving and which direction you're moving, what an event that one person sees as happening in the past, you won't have perceived it yet. It'll be in the future for you. Both perspectives are equally valid, so the future and the past must coexist because they depend on your subjective perspective, which direction specifically and how fast you're moving. So continuing with Brian Greene, with this bold insight, Einstein shattered one of the most basic concepts of how we experience time. Here's a quote from Einstein: "The distinction between past, present, and future," he once said, "is only an illusion, however persistent. This entire 3-dimensional world is an illusion, a holographic illusion, according to string theorists like Brian Greene himself. The past, present, and future exist out at the horizon of the cosmos, and they unfold in an illusory way here in our 3-dimensional world." Something Plato also definitely says in the cave allegory of the Republic. So here's Einstein. That's no objective now. Here's a quote from his book, Relativity, the Special and General Theory. "Since there exists in this 4-dimensional structure, space-time, no longer any sections which represent now objectively, the concepts of happening and becoming are indeed not completely suspended, but yet complicated. It appears, therefore, more natural to think of physical reality as a 4-dimensional existence instead of, as hitherto, the evolution of a 3-dimensional existence." So this has profound implications for the theory of evolution, Darwinian evolution. According to string theory, even if we accept everything that the theory of Darwinian evolution tells us, that timeline from subatomic particles to complex organisms, each point on that evolutionary timeline actually coexists. So there's no actual evolution. There's a holographic illusion of evolution. And that is much more in line with Plato's theory that the material world radiates from these absolute ideas, these eternal structuring principles, all of which are contained in the idea of the good, again, which I identify with the central singularity and the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. Just to ground this in the best science that we have, it's a huge point to know that the past, the present, and the future coexist. And let me just say this, the way I think about it that helps me is, and I've read other people describe it this way, space-time. Just like in front of you and behind you in space are both there, even though you're where you are, because space and time are interwoven in one fabric. What's in front of you in time and behind you in time also still exist, just like they do in space. The past and the future coexist, just like in front of you and behind you in space. And another point that I'm going to say now, just to put it in here, Immanuel Kant, the 18th century European philosopher, who was responding to David Hume, the great British empiricist. David Hume says, "Oh, I'm an empiricist. I believe in what I can see, smell, touch, taste, and hear." Well, I don't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear space. It's, by definition, nothing. It's empty. It doesn't contact any of my five sense organs, and therefore it's a figment of my imagination. So is time, and therefore so is the idea of cause and effect, causality. These are figments of the imagination because they're not empirically observable. You can't hear them, smell them, taste them, touch them, or see them. Immanuel Kant said, "Oh, you awoke me from my dogmatic slumber, David Hume, but they're not figments of the imagination. Rather, they're forced upon us at birth. They are inborn, a priori categories of thought, lenses of cognition through which we're forced to perceive the unknowable thing in itself. Space, time, and causality, these are these lenses of cognition. Those are archetypes of the collective unconscious. Those are absolute ideas imprinted on the soul themselves." And so just whenever you look out and see, oh, I'm in this vast, uncaring universe, I'm looking out at all these stars in the sky, that entire expanse of space-time and causality is projected from your psyche, and I'm equating the psyche with the singularity. We're going to get into Carl Jung's definition of a psyche. Psyche equals singularity was the title of my dissertation, and we'll go through the formula that Jung had. Highest intensity in the smallest space, that's his definition of a psyche. That is a singularity. Highest intensity is infinite gravity. Smallest space is a point. That's a psyche. That's what I'm saying each of us is. And space-time radiates from the psyche or the singularity at the Big Bang and back in from the horizon of the cosmos. All right, so continuing here, the curriculum for the Philosopher King in Plato's Republic. So here's what we'll be going over: the divided line analogy in Book 6 of the Republic, the cave allegory in Book 7, and then the need to study the four ascending dimensions of nature. So here's, in the Republic, Socrates, Plato depicts his martyred mentor Socrates talking with these young men, and they're trying to discover what is justice. Socrates says, "I don't know, but here's a plan. Why don't we look for justice in the ideally just city? Because the city is like an expanded version of the individual psyche or soul. And it'll be easier to see justice in this big pattern, and we'll extrapolate down to the smaller pattern of the individual. What do you think? Okay, let's do it." All right. And then they develop in their imagination this ideally perfectly just society. And the key to justice in this society is to educate the ruling elite. And the curriculum that he creates for that became the curriculum for academia. Plato established the first academy in the olive grove called Academia, just north of Athens. So this entire endeavor is an academic endeavor. Susskind's an academic. He's got a PhD. Carl Jung is an academic. He's a psychiatrist, an MD. I don't know if he had a PhD or not, but Socrates was not an academic because he came before the academy, but he's the ground of academia because of his disciple Plato. Okay, And then this study of the four ascending dimensions of nature, that's through mathematics is how he's going to do it. That's studying plane geometry is the second dimension, solid geometry is the third dimension, solid geometry and movement is the fourth dimension, which is time, which is astronomy and music, as we'll see. All right, so here is a chart that I made because I didn't want to violate copyright infringement rules, but you can get better diagrams if you go looking online. But here's the divided line. Socrates says, imagine the universe like a line cut into two unequal sections, one bigger and one smaller. And now divide each of those two segments by the same proportion. So you have four segments. The two top segments are the spiritual world, the intelligible realm. It's of the eternal but invisible forms. They're not empirically observable, but they are observable to the eye of the soul. The bottom two segments are the visible empirical realm, the sensible realm. And here's how he divides this. At the lowest level, you have images, shadows, and reflections. So paintings or a photograph or a shadow on the wall of a three-dimensional object or a mirror reflection. That's the lowest level of reality, these two-dimensional images. Particularly important for us as mirror reflections. And that level of intelligence is called opinion. Then they are images and shadows of the next level up on the divided line, which is visible three-dimensional objects. Those empirically observable forms are the highest realm of the sensible realm. The next level up on the divided line is the lowest level of the spiritual, intelligible but invisible realm, and that's the realm of the mathematical forms that describe the visible forms. So just as the shadows are shadows of 3D things, the mirror reflections are reflections of three-dimensional objects, so are the three-dimensional objects like mirror reflections of the mathematical forms that describe them. So, for example, every triangle in the material world we see made out of, you know, like the top of a pyramid or something, they're all projections from the archetype of triangle. And the Pythagorean theorem, for example, describes perfectly every right-angled triangle. But the laws of physics are the mathematical forms. So the physical world that we see, like the solar system, the mathematical forms that describe the movements of those planets, they exist in the eternal realm at the lowest level. And they are like reflections or shadows of the highest level of eternal forms, like justice and beauty and love. All of those absolute forms finally radiate from the ultimate idea of the good, which is beyond being because it's the source of being. And I'm identifying the idea of the good with the gravitational singularity that exists at each point of the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. So that is the divided line in Book 6 of the Republic. And then he describes that with the famous cave allegory. So each of the four segments of the line correlates to a part of the allegory of the cave, which I'll very briefly describe. He says, imagine someone at birth taken down to a subterranean cave, chained head to foot and forced to look at shadows cast on a wall in front of them by puppets walked back and forth behind a wall with the puppets are up on sticks so that the wall blocks the shadows of the guardians, and the fire above the entrance to the cave casts the shadow of these puppets on the back wall. Now, these prisoners think that the shadows are reality. This image isn't as accurate as it could be because the prisoners also see their own shadows of their own bodies and their neighbors. They can see their shadow. They think they are their shadow. They think they are their two-dimensional shadow. They think their neighbors' shadows are their real forms, and the puppets, they think all the shadows, all that there is, and they pride themselves on who can predict which shadow will come in which sequence. The really bright ones get a knack for knowing which guard shuffles and makes certain sounds, but they hear it echoing off the wall, and they can predict, oh, okay, to use the image here, it's going to be soldier shadow, horse shadow, dog, and then it's going to be dog, horse, soldier, and then they pride themselves. It was an allusion to people who pride themselves on being able to predict where the planets will be by just empirical observations. Now, says Socrates, imagine someone comes down from the real world, breaks the chains, and turns a prisoner around and forces him to see the puppets and the light. The fire will blind him. He'll think he's gone insane. He'll think that you're some horrible person. And he'll think the shadow's real and what you're showing him is madness. And then you drag him up the rough and steep ascent outside. Now the sun is really blinding him and he's in horrible pain. He thinks he's lost his mind. But gradually at night, he'll be able to see things, and he'll be able to see the sun reflected in the moon and the planets. And then in the daytime, he can look in puddles of water and see reflections of the sun. And then finally, he'll be able to look at the sun itself. And then he'll realize, here's the source of everything in this outer world and in everything down in that cave where I grew up, which was this horrible place. And then Socrates says, now that person will be told, go back down to the cave and free another prisoner, just as you've been freed. When he goes back down, he'll be blinded by the darkness. They'll laugh at him because he can't see the shadows anymore. But as he gets accustomed to it, he'll see better and better. But as he's learning to reacclimate himself to the darkness, when he's telling these people, oh, you're just chained up prisoners looking at shadows in the cave, they'll think he's blind and insane, and they would kill him if they could get their hands on him, rather than let him turn them into the insane, blind person that he has become. And gradually, though, that returned prisoner can see the shadows, and all he has to do is turn around and see, oh, here's which puppets are coming in which order. He'll be 10,000 times better at the game than the people who have never been released. So here's the allegory. As the shadows in the cave are, they correlate to the three-dimensional objects that we see. The physical bodies we see in the three-dimensional forms are like shadows on the cave. And the world outside of our cave is the eternal realm of these eternal forms, the absolute idea of tree, the absolute idea of horse, and anything that you can perceive in the three-dimensional world is radiating from some eternal perfect form of that thing. And all of them radiate ultimately from the idea of the good. So by this cave allegory and the divided line analogy, the implication is, an important one is, that the laws of physics, the laws of the mathematical forms that describe the three-dimensional forms, they are in turn mirror reflections of the higher level of absolute ideas, like justice and beauty, anima and animus. This is where Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli were saying, let's find these mirror symmetries between the mathematical laws of physics and the laws of the archetypes of psychology. This is what Plato was saying to do. Jung and Pauli took up that original academic quest, and I'm saying the parallels between Jungian and Platonic psychology, which is very similar to the Vedanta cosmology, with the Atman, Brahman paradox of the psyche, the particle wave paradox, it's reflected in quantum physics. I'm saying that we've achieved this. We've come full circle back to Plato's original cosmology with this dawn of Jungian psychology and holographic string theory. And the most precise mirror symmetry between archetypal psychology and holographic string theory, I'm saying, is these near-death experiences. Okay, so Brian Greene, again, this great string theorist and ally of Leonard Susskind, here's what he said in his book, The Fabric of the Cosmos, Space-Time and the Texture of Reality. He says, whereas Plato envisioned common perceptions as revealing a mere shadow of reality, the holographic principle concurs, but turns the metaphor on its head. The shadows, the things that are flattened out and hence live on a lower dimensional surface, are real, while what seem to be the more richly structured, higher dimensional entities, us, the world around us, the three-dimensional objects, he's saying, are evanescent projections of the shadows. While it is a fantastically strange idea and one whose role in the final understanding of space-time is far from clear, to Hooft and Suskind's so-called holographic principle is well motivated. So Greene is saying that the holographic principle is an inside-out version of Plato's cave allegory, because in Plato's cave, the two-dimensional shadows on the wall are projected from the three-dimensional forms, whereas in string theory, it's the two-dimensional holographic film on the wall, ceiling, and the floor that project the three-dimensional forms inside. I am saying Yeah, it appears to be some kind of an inversion, but it isn't really, because what appears to us from our embodied perspective on Earth to be the perfectly flat two-dimensional sphere surrounding us, when you're out there having an out-of-body near-death experience, it's an infinitely rich, infinitely textured, infinitely deep realm of the eternal absolute ideas. Carl Jung said he experienced the archetypes of the marriage of Hera and Zeus and all of these mythological archetypal scenarios when he was out at this horizon of the cosmos, the most blissful experiences of his life, he's saying. And it is from that horizon of the cosmos where these archetypal forms exist that this three-dimensional box-like world is projected, and each of us is hung up to the horizon of the cosmos in our little box by a thread. So the cave allegory isn't actually an inside-out version of holographic string theory. It's a right-side-out version, and it's this predicted parallel, predicted mirror symmetry between archetypal psychology and physics, in this case, holographic string theory. So just to reiterate, this is such an important point. Brian Greene, this well-respected string theorist, in another book, The Hidden Reality, Parallel Universes, and the Deep Laws of the Cosmos, he says, 2 millennia later, it seems that Plato's cave may be more than a metaphor. To turn his suggestion on its head, reality, not its mere shadow, may take place on a distant boundary surface, while everything we witness in the three common spatial dimensions is a projection of that faraway unfolding reality that is maybe akin to a hologram or really a holographic movie. Huge paradigm shift, perfectly in line with Plato and Jung. So again, academia has come full circle, I'm saying, back to its origin in Plato's Republic. So in book 7, after the cave allegory, Socrates says, okay, now let's get down to brass tacks. How are we going to teach these soldiers to become enlightened? How are we going to draw them out of the cave of illusion and open the eye of their soul to the absolute ideas, culminating with the idea of the good? It'll be through mathematics, and you'll start with just the simple numbers on a number line, dimensionless numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They don't have any extension. And then from that, you perceive them on a number line. Now there's 1, 2, 3. There's a directionality to it, but it's a one-dimensional line. And then the second dimension is studied by plane geometry. So linear geometry would be addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. It's all on a number line. Expanding out to the next dimension, you have plane geometry, Cartesian geometry, we would call it today. Then the next level up is three-dimensional solid geometry, which wasn't well developed in Greece at the time, Socrates and his interlocutors point out. Then the next level up, which is time, is three-dimensional solids in periodic motion, specifically as studied by the Pythagorean sister sciences of astronomy and music. So three-dimensional solids, the planets, moving in periodic, regularly recurring movements. Now, that was a big question for them back then. How do you describe mathematically the movements of the planets? Because they were looking at them from a geocentric perspective, where they have retrograde movements and it seems complex. It's much easier to describe the geometry of the movements of the planets when you look at the sun as the center of the solar system, and then the planets revolve around the sun in these elliptical orbits. That's what Copernicus discovered in Galileo. And so at any rate, that's what the quest that led to that started here in the Republic. And it's those mathematical forms that describe the periodic movements of the planets and the periodic movements of, for example, vibrating strings that describe the fourth dimension of time. So he goes on to say, then as the fourth study, I said, let us set down astronomy. We may venture to suppose, I said, that as the eyes are framed for astronomy, so the ears are framed for the movement of harmony, and these are in some sort kindred sciences, as the Pythagoreans affirm, and we admit. So astronomy and music is studies the fourth dimension of time. And then here is in the Laws, another dialogue, where it's the Athenian stranger who's talking instead of Socrates, but he goes again, they're describing how to establish in this instance, not an ideally just society, but a much better society through education. And he says that then there are, of course, 3 subjects for the freeborn still to study. Ciphering and arithmetic make one subject, that's dimensionless numbers. Then he says mensuration, linear, superficial, and solid. That's first, second, and third dimensional geometry taken as one single steady form of second. The third is the true relations of the planetary orbits. That's the fourth dimensional study of time to one another. So you study these ascending dimensions of space-time. What's the mathematical forms required to describe them? That helps you open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good. So here is Michio Kaku. So I'm saying the mathematical education for the philosopher king comes true in string theory. Here's Kaku. He says, the laws of physics can be compared to the laws of harmony allowed on the string. The universe itself, composed of countless vibrating strings, would then be comparable to a symphony. So you see, astronomy and music are combined in string theory. The vibrations of those strings makes it plausible to see the universe as this symphony of vibrating strings. And he wrote that in Hyperspace, a Scientific Odyssey through Parallel Universes, Time Warps, and the 10th Dimension. So here's returning to the Republic. Socrates says, I take it that if the investigation of all these studies goes far enough to bring out their community, you have to keep moving my little face icon there, and kinship with one another. So how are these four dimensions related to each other? And to infer their affinities, then to busy ourselves with them contributes to our desired end, and the labor taken is not lost, but otherwise it is in vain. So if you just study these four dimensions of nature and don't see how they're all united, then it's a waste of time, he's saying. A big problem with seeing how these four dimensions are related is that the units of measurement used for each dimension are incommensurable with the others. So the unit of measurement, for example, for the time dimension would be a second. Well, you can't add and subtract a second from an inch or a centimeter, which describes the first dimension of length. So how can you add and subtract and mathematically unite the four dimensions? Socrates points out in the laws, it's the Athenian stranger saying that's a problem that we don't know how to do. It's still a problem to this day, but at any rate, that's a whole nother story. Continuing, I say the fifth and final stage of education may possibly be fulfilled by a recognition of how all sentience in space-time is synthesized in the omnicentric singularity and surrounding horizon of the cosmos as a comparison of Susskind string theory, the NDEs described by Plato and Jung, and the theory of astrological synchronicities described by Tarnas indicates. So how are all the dimensions of space-time and our consciousness synthesized and united? I'm saying by seeing the psyche as one with a central singularity and the holographic horizon of the cosmos. That's how we can see all points of space-time, all the dimensions of nature, everything united as one. That's the idea of the good. So continuing here, then I said, and he's describing the power of dialectic, which is when two psyches talk to each other and contradict each other's flaws in the arguments, and they eventually perfect the argument, which reaches down to the absolute archetypes imprinted on the soul. Then, said I, is not dialectic the only process of inquiry that advances in this manner, doing away with hypotheses up to the first principle itself in order to find confirmation there? And it is literally true that when the eye of the soul is sunk in the barbaric slough of the Orphic myth, dialectic gently draws it forth and leads it up, employing the sciences which we have enumerated. So dialectic, these conversations, the assumption is that all of the absolute ideas are imprinted on each soul. Socrates says, I don't teach you anything. I help you remember what you forgot, these absolute forms of eternal knowledge that are imprinted on your soul. The mathematical study of space-time helps draw that conversation up to the one supreme source of everything. And over the centuries, with this academic progression from Plato's original academy, I'm saying it fulfilled what he predicted it would. We have achieved that point in history where we've come full circle back to the original academic cosmology, which I am saying is itself a form of empirical evidence for string theory. So string theory is under attack. Oh, it's not real. They've wasted all 40 years of physics and what's going on. I'm not a physicist, but I do know this. Wolfgang Pauli was a physicist, one of the very best theoretical physicists of his time, if not the best mathematical theoretical physicist. And he made a prediction with Carl Jung, the best psychologist of his era, that there would be a mirror symmetry between the laws of physics and psychology. That scientific prediction came true. I'm saying that's empirical evidence for string theory. All right, so let me just continue here. Wolfgang Pauli and the divided line. So here's where Pauli is going to reiterate in his own language Plato's curriculum for the philosopher king. So he says the ordering, I'm going to move this down here again, the ordering and regulating factors, so these are the archetypes, must be placed beyond the distinction of physical and psychic, as Plato's ideas share the notion of a concept and of a force of nature. They create actions out of themselves. I am very much in favor of referring to the ordering and regulating factors in terms of archetypes. But then it would be impermissible to define them as contents of the psyche. The mentioned inner images, dominant features of the collective unconscious after Jung, are rather psychic manifestations of the archetypes, which, however, would also have to put forth, create, condition anything law-like in the behavior of the corporeal world. The laws of this world would then be the physical manifestations of the archetypes. Each law of nature should then have an inner correspondence and vice versa, even though this is not always directly visible today. So they're looking for the mirror symmetry between the laws of physics and the laws of psychology. The images that emerge from the archetypes of the collective unconscious, that's psychology. Those images are not the archetypes. They're the images that come from the archetypes. And the physical images we see are not the archetypes. They are radiating from the archetypes. But when you notice the parallels between the laws of the psychic images and the laws of mathematical physics, when they mirror each other, that implies that they're both radiating from some common source at this level that Jung and Pauli call the psychoid. It's not psychic, it's not physical, it's something deeper than both. That's where the archetypes are. The main point is there's a mirror symmetry between psychology and physics, and the clearest example of that is the parallel between Carl Jung's near-death experience and Susskind's holographic string theory, but there's many more parallels. For example, Carl Jung's theory that the psychic image that emerges in the human psyche from the ultimate archetype of the self, which is his word for the idea of the good, is a mandala. Well, if the image that emerges from the psyche is a mandala, where's the mirror reflection in the physical world? I'm saying it's the gravitational effects of black holes, which are geometrically perfect mandalas. If the soul is a psyche, the image of the psyche is a mandala. Well, if the singularity is a psyche, the image that it creates will be a mandala. So there's another perfect correlation between Jungian psychology and holographic string theory. Another correlation, I mentioned it briefly before, is the particle wave nature of quantum physics. If you look at it at a particle, and according to the two-slit experiment of quantum physics is where this was finalized, it behaves as a particle. When you're not observing it, you can infer its effects that it exists as a wave of probability, a wave of mathematical potential for where a particle might be were it to be observed, most likely at the peak. Jung said, and Pauli said, that particle wave parallel, that complementarity, the mutually exclusive but complementary visions of a particle or a wave, they're mutually exclusive because if you look at it, it's a particle. If you don't look at it, it behaves like a wave. You can't see it as a particle and a wave at the same time. The mirror reflection of that is the conscious and the unconscious mind. When you observe yourself, for example, think of yourself, you're self-reflecting, that's, oh, I am an individual. I'm a morally autonomous individual. But as soon as you stop observing yourself, you get carried away on statistical waves of animalistically possible behavior. So there is this parallel between the particle wave paradox of matter and the conscious-unconscious paradox of the psyche. And in Hindu cosmology or the Vedanta cosmology, Atman Brahman, the self is an Atman, an individual particle of personal subjective consciousness. At the same time, we're all merged in the impersonal waves of Brahman, the mutually exclusive complementary perspectives of the self. All right, but I'm going to keep moving here because it's 12:30 already. And all right, so this is long, but this is a big, important letter because this ends with Carl Jung's definition of a psyche, which is equivalent to a gravitational singularity. To cut to the chase, so you know why I put all this in there, And I'll read through it quickly, and I might skip a little bit. But he concludes, psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So the highest intensity of energy is infinite density. The smallest space is zero volume. That's the definition of a gravitational singularity. And as you can see by the letter, which he wrote to J.R. Smithies on Leap Day, February 29, 1952, he's writing it in the context of general and special relativity. Carl Jung learned about special relativity from Einstein himself when they had conversations over dinner in Switzerland while Einstein was working on general relativity. And Jung subsequently learned about general relativity. So let me just read briefly, and I'll probably skip here. He says, the question is, in short, so here's his problem. He's saying the psyche isn't a byproduct of material combinations. It's its own thing. Psyche is eternal. And therefore, if it exists, it must have its own energy. And if it has energy, it must have mass, according to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. A little bit of energy or mass, if you take that amount of mass and multiply that by the number that is the speed of light squared, that's how much energy you will have. Every little bit of matter has an enormous amount of energy in it. That's why atomic bombs work. But if E equals mc squared is a true equation, then how come we can't measure the mass of a psyche? How come we can't measure the mass that's correlated with psychic energy? And here's how he tries to explain it. In a previous letter, he said, maybe it's because it's too small. We just don't have the technology that can measure the mass associated with a psyche. But in this one, he reverses that strategy and says, maybe we can't measure the psychic energy because it's infinite. So here he goes. The question is, in short, shouldn't we give up the time-space categories altogether when we are dealing with psychic existence? It might be that psyche should be understood as unextended intensity. So that's a singularity. It's not extended in space, but it's infinitely intense, and not as a body moving with time. One might assume that the psyche gradually rising from minute extensity to infinite intensity, transcending, for instance, the velocity of light, and thus irrealizing the body. That would account for the elasticity of space under ESP conditions. If there's no body moving in space, there can be no time either, and that would account for the elasticity of time. So then he says, yes, this sounds unextended intensity, sounds like a contradiction. How can you have something not extended in space and yet have any energy at all? And then he's saying, yeah, but if you accelerate an object to the speed of light, it disappears. According to special relativity, as a physical object accelerates through space, it contracts in the direction of travel and its internal clock slows down. At the speed of light, it's contracted to zero extension in space and the clock stops. If you accelerate a material object at light speed, it disappears from space-time. That's what he's talking about, giving up minute extensity for infinite intensity. So just going to the bottom paragraph here. All this is certainly highly speculative, in fact, unwarrantably adventurous, but psi phenomena are equally disconcerting and lay claim to an unusually high jump, yet any hypothesis is warrantable inasmuch as it explains observable facts and is consistent in itself. In light of this view, the brain might be a transformer station in which the relatively infinite tension or intensity of the psyche proper is transformed into perceptible frequencies or extensions. Conversely, the fading of introspective perception of the body explains itself as due to a gradual psychification, i.e. intensification at the expense of extension. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So again, if you translate that equation, highest intensity is infinite density, smallest space is zero volume. That's the definition of a gravitational singularity. So psyche equals singularity. Once you identify yourself, your psyche, with a gravitational singularity, you see how all the laws of psychology are mirrored by the laws of holographic string theory. So this is this enormously important letter. All right, so the mandala as an image of the self. Here's something that Carl Jung said in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I knew that in finding the mandala as an expression of the self, I had attained what was for me the ultimate. Perhaps someone else knows more, but not I. So he's said, when a psyche is torn by opposing demands, the self archetype, which I'm equating with a central singularity and encompassing horizon, compensates that psyche with dream images of mandalas, circles or spheres with a central point. That they're like road signs that lead the conflicted psyche towards wholeness through the union of opposites, which is another way Jung defines the archetype of the self, which I'm equating with the idea of the good, the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. All opposites are united in the mandala of the inside-out black hole universe. Past, present, and future are united at each point of the encompassing sphere and that central point. Any pair of archetypal opposites you can think of find their union in this supreme archetype of the idea of the good, which I'm equating with this inside-out black hole universe. So continuing here, Jung says the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. So I'm saying this central singularity correlates to the conscious ego pole of the psyche, and the horizon of the cosmos correlates to the collective unconscious. But those are relative terms. If you're out at the horizon of the cosmos, you'll see yourself as the center of the universe, and us here on Earth out at the horizon. And there's this cosmic complementarity, which is paralleled by the complementarity between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And if you identify the conscious with the central singularity and the unconscious with the horizon of the cosmos, you see how it fits perfectly. So I say, if the laws of physics and psychology mirror each other, and if the unus mundus presents itself as a mandala image to the psyche, we each perceive inwardly, in what outwardly observable form, if any, does it demonstrate itself in the physical world. So what's the mirror symmetry of the mandala images in the psyche? Black holes in the inside-out black hole universe are nature's geometrically perfect mandalas. And then here's this equation. Self equals conscious, unconscious equals central singularity, cosmic horizon. I know we're closing up. It's 12:37, so I'm going to maybe have to speed things up here. But to relate this to astrology, here's an important point. According to Jung, if mandala symbolism is the psychological equivalent of the unus mundus, another word for the self or the idea of the good or God. So if mandala symbolism is the psychological equivalent of the unus mundus, then synchronicity is its parapsychological equivalent. So synchronicities he's relating to mandalas. They indicate a union of mind and matter, meaning perceiving minds and the empirically observable physical world seem to be united by synchronicity, just as mandalas are the psychological equivalent of the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, which is what he means by the unus mundus, one world. Apparently, two worlds of matter and mind are actually one world. And it's explained by the mandala. So here's another quote from Jung. The horoscope is itself a mandala, a clock with a dark center and a leftward circumambulatio with houses and planetary phases. The horoscope has Earth in the center and all of the planets superimposed out, well, not superimposed, but all of the planets out at this outer circle, this outer perimeter. Just like holographic string theory puts all of the information of the universe out at the outermost sphere. So there's this correlation between the mandala, would be a kind of a two-dimensional version of the universe as a whole, according to holographic string theory. There's this correlation. Susskind's mandala cosmos has Earth in the center and all of the information from the past, present, and future of the three-dimensional space smeared out on a two-dimensional horizon of the cosmos. Similarly, the horoscope mandala describes Earth as the central point and all other planets and constellations superimposed onto a single encompassing circle. All right, so here's the myth of At the end of the Republic, Socrates describes the near-death experience of a soldier named who woke up on his own funeral pyre and then recalled what he'd seen in the afterlife. He said that he'd eventually come to this mysterious realm where he could see the universe like a series of nested bowls. So instead of a sphere, it's a hemisphere, a series of bowls laid within each other. And the rims of the bowls correlate to the orbits of the planets around the Earth. And at the outermost sphere or hemisphere are the three sisters, the fates, who represent past, present, and future. And they rotate these spheres in different directions at different speeds that accounts for how we on Earth see the planets rotating sometimes in one direction, then another. And they take the threads of each soul's destiny in hand. Each reincarnating soul is out there at the horizon of the cosmos, and they choose these lots of what life they're going to have next. And then the fates ratify what they've chosen with the threads of destiny. And I'm saying there's the mirror symmetry with string theory, which Carl Jung, at his near-death experience, he said, it seemed to me as if each of us is in our own little box of illusion tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread, and that the past, the present, and the future are out there, and that this is some kind of an illusion projected by these threads. Well, that the threads of destiny fill in this correlation between the near-death experience of the myth of and holographic string theory. They don't describe, Socrates doesn't describe the threads actually being interwoven from the horizon of the cosmos down through each concentric planetary orbit to the central Earth, but it's implied because these threads of destiny belong to each reincarnating soul, and the souls, when they take on a new body, go back to the central Earth, and they're attached to these threads of destiny, which are simultaneously stored out at the horizon of the cosmos. So, so I'm not going to read this whole thing because of time, but the 5 visible planets that you can see are accounted for by these bolts. And here, I'll just read this quote here from the Republic. On each of the rims of the circles, a siren stood, borne around in its revolution and uttering one sound, one note, and from all the 8 there was the concord of a single harmony. Then the 3 fates sing along with the harmony of the hemispheres as they're turning these bowls. Lachesis singing the things that were, that's the past, Clotho the things that are, the present, and Atropos the things that are to be, the future. Past, present, and future, out at this outermost hemisphere. In the Timaeus, the astronomer Timaeus clearly describes the universe as a sphere, and that the mother substance is this outermost sphere that projects the material world inward. In the Phaedrus is a description, Socrates is describing how souls reincarnate, and in there, the universe is a sphere, and you take the winged chariot of the psyche out to the outermost sphere, and that's where the absolute ideas are, and they project the material world in. So this is definitely a Platonic thing. The archetypes, the absolute eternal forms of knowledge, are out at the outermost sphere. In the Republic, they describe it as a hemisphere, I think for the purpose of helping us see these internal orbits. He's trying to describe astronomy with that. But you have the singing of the sirens on each spinning hemisphere, plus the fates sing, and they have the threads of destiny. So you're combining astronomy and music, which is what Socrates said you had to learn back in book 7. It's all combined in this near-death experience. And we're going to see how the language Plato uses is similar to astrology. So this is Robin Waterfield from the Oxford World's Classics. Here's what he says. So in Desmond Lee's translation, the fates make the threads of its destiny irreversible. In Robin Waterfield's he translates the word irreversible to unalterable. And here's what he says. He says, unalterable. Perhaps we are to imagine one of them spinning the warp and the other the woof of a person's life. There are clear astrological connotations to the passage. The word translated destiny also means, or came to mean, degree on the zodiacal circle. Ratify is cognate with the rulership of a planet. In short, as well as setting an individual's destiny in a more abstract sense, the fates do so according to the positions of the planets, Atropos, and the zodiacal signs, Clotho. Note that despite Plato's use of the word unalterable, it is only the broad framework which is fixed. The whole of Plato's philosophy leaves room for self-improvement within that framework. So Robin Waterfield is saying that the myth of contains language that was used by astrologers, and it's not an implausible theory that he has, because astrology works perfectly with Plato's theory of the archetypes, and his description of where those archetypes are stored, specifically the horizon of the cosmos, does seem to be mirrored by holographic string theory, which does provide a mechanism for how archetypal astrology works. So here's the conclusion, which I'll read. And then I have examples of astrology. I don't know how much time. I'll just very briefly look at them so we can take some questions. So in conclusion, in the cave allegory, the prisoner had to adjust his benighted eyes to the blinding sun by looking at reflections of it at night in the moon and planets, and by day in puddles of water. Astrology is the mirror that enables us to see the gods intelligibly reflected in the meaningful correlations between the orbits of the planets and the cycles of dramatic life on Earth. As the planets reflect the sun, so do the planetary gods reflect the spiritual sun, the idea of the good. In conclusion, the near-death experience Socrates recalls in the myth of at the end of the Republic combines a musical string theory of information conservation at the cosmic horizon and allusions to astrology, which supports the theory that those three topics, string theory and astrology and near-death experience, those three topics complete the curriculum for the philosopher king in Book 7 of the Republic, thereby enabling you to open the eye of the soul to the idea of the good. If that is the case, the books by Jung, Tarnas, and Susskind render Plato's hidden curriculum possible today. So there's my argument. And then I go on to discuss, as examples of astrology, the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the early 90s when string theory was discovered. And I'm just going to show the alignments. This is Richard Tarnas talking about how the discovery of all these alternative realities and this holographic principle and the multiverse are emblematic of the Uranus-Neptune archetypal conjunction. And so I'm just going to skip here is August 20, 1993. This is when Susskind published one of his early papers about string theory and black holes, which has this holographic principle, and it leads to the multiverse, which is so reminiscent of the Neptune-Uranus conjunction. August 20, 1993, Uranus conjunct Neptune was exact. So he wrote another paper in July, but the first paper that I found was this one, which was just a month later, and I just randomly typed in the date, and I thought that was cool. It's an exact Uranus-Neptune conjunction on the day he published this paper, just a couple of months after he was first confronted with this whole conundrum of information conservation. And there was also a Saturn square Pluto at 4.09 degrees. So here's the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. Here's Saturn-Pluto. So it's kind of combining both. Then I go into Saturn-Pluto and the history of black holes. So I will just briefly read a little bit of this because we've got 12 minutes, and this one I think is cool. So a singularity, a point of infinite gravity inside a black hole, is the purest cosmological manifestation of the Saturn-Pluto hard alignments imaginable, I say. Here's from Richard Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche. The Saturn archetype encompasses all that involves boundaries and limits. It defines and grounds, constricts and solidifies. Saturn is, in Nietzsche's phrase, the spirit of gravity, both heavy and dark. I think you can see how that relates to a black hole. The spirit of gravity means the archetype of gravity. I say the singularity, a space-timeless point of infinite gravity that crushes all space-time into an infinitesimal point of infinite darkness, is the archetype of gravity itself. According to Plato and Jung, an archetype is the eternal infinite source of its many material manifestations. So Saturn-Pluto and the history of black hole science. Here's another quote from Tarnas. During Saturn-Pluto alignments, the Plutonic principle seemed to empower and intensify each of the above-mentioned Saturnian tendencies and qualities to an overwhelming degree and on a massive scale. Besides this intensifying and empowering influence, the Pluto archetype also appeared to add into the larger complex its own distinctive qualities involving instinctual and elemental forces, titanic power and violent intensity, violation and destruction, chthonic and underworld depths, and evolutionary transformation. The archetypal combination of Saturn and Pluto suggested a dominant quality of dark weightiness, a vector of downward depth, hard contraction, grim reality, death, and loss, the enduring power and weight of the past. So Saturn and Pluto, the archetypal combination is this dark weightiness, vector of downward depth, overwhelming power on a massive degree. That is a black hole. It's infinitely heavy. It's got an irresistible downward vector of gravitational pull towards the central singularity. It's contracted infinitely. It takes all of these archetypal qualities to their infinite extreme, which I say makes it the archetype itself, not an empirical emanation from the archetype. But at any rate, if archetypal astrology is accurate and you can study history and see how these archetypes emerge through historical events, then a good test for that theory would be to track the history of black hole science, which should correlate with the hard alignments, squares, oppositions, and conjunctions of Saturn and Pluto related to the central Earth. So I have here the history of black holes. This is what Tarnas wrote about the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions in the beginning of World War I, the beginning of World War II. I'm going to skip that because I'm just going to go here. And this is February 24, 1916, Saturn conjunct Pluto, 8.28 degrees. So where is Saturn on this? Oh yeah, Saturn and Pluto here. They are 8.28 degrees. For Tarnas, conjunctions are in effect out 20 degrees. And so this is 8 degrees. So it's within effect. And this is when Carl Schwarzschild published the first paper indicating that Einstein's theory of general relativity implies the existence of what we now call black holes, central singularities surrounded by an event horizon. He originally gave Einstein the exact solutions for his gravitational field equations. Einstein was very pleased. And then a couple of months later, he puts this paper out, which implies black holes, and Einstein was very dismayed. Einstein rejected the idea of black holes to his death. But at any rate, it's evidence for astrology. So Oppenheimer wrote a paper on September 1st, 1939, which was the beginning of World War II. Hitler invaded Poland, but it was also when he wrote this paper on continued gravitational contraction. So the beginning of World War II, Oppenheimer published a paper about black holes where he described how they burn through their nuclear fuel. A star burns through its nuclear fuel and then contracts indefinitely down into singularity. He gave the name singularity here in this paper. And it's the Saturn-Pluto archetypes. World War II begins, and this very powerful definition of a black hole that does correlate with the Saturn-Pluto archetype. Here's the alignment. September 1, 1939, Saturn square Pluto within 1 degree. Saturn square Pluto. There's Pluto and there's Saturn. So it's 90 degree within, 1 degree. Start of World War II, powerful black hole paper. That's a good confirmation of archetypal astrology's predictive power. April 10, 2019, the first image of a black hole that we've all seen, and it was a Saturn conjunct Pluto, 2.54 degrees. So Saturn is wherever Saturn is, Saturn and Pluto. They are within 2.54 degrees of each other, and we have the first image of a black hole, which is there. And that is the end of the presentation. So I'll take some questions here. We have 6 minutes left. I hope people have.
Okay, there are many questions.
I'd imagine there are.
And I will need to finish a few minutes. I was just typing in actually to say that we're not going to get to everybody. So can you see the Q&A box? Do you want to pick something out of there because they're, rather than me read to you? Can you see that?
I can't see it.
If you hover down the bottom, there's the little, you'll see 33 with the red on it. Can you see that?
No, I can't.
No. Okay. All right. I will just quickly read a couple then, but I'm sorry, guys, we won't get through everybody. Matthias was asking if you're familiar with Chris Langan and his CTMU.
I don't think I am.
Okay, that's quick. Brett is asking, is dark matter comparable to the ether, quintessence, etc., or what are your thoughts about its role in astrology?
Yeah, dark matter. I'm not so familiar with it. I focus more on dark energy, which is the expansion of space-time down at the quantum vacuum because of the particle-antiparticle pair collisions. You mentioned the quintessence, the fifth element, the ether. I equate that with the outermost horizon of the cosmos. That's how Plato and the Vedic scriptures describe it. There's concentric spheres of the universe: earth, water, fire, air, and then ether. And the past, the present, and the future are recorded in the ether, the Akashic record. In the Vedic cosmology, they have some models have three extra etheric spheres: mind, intelligence, and false ego. Whichever is the outermost sphere, that's where the past, present, and future are superimposed at each point. That's the quintessence from which all of the other essences are projected.
Catherine's asking, the issue of nothing can exceed the speed of light is limited to this physical universe. Could it be exceeded in a parallel universe or astral causal?
The speed of light, I don't know. It's a good question. The parameters, the laws of physics are different in different universes, says Susskind. So maybe the speed of light would be different in some universes. I'm not sure about that, but what I do say is that each of us is a psyche, which is a singularity, and we are a point of infinite density, infinite gravity. According to general relativity, gravity and acceleration are equivalent terms. So each of us is traveling into ourselves at an infinite speed. So I do believe that we are, you can surpass the speed of light, but just not as a material thing. Once you have a material object go faster than light, it's no longer a material object. Jung, in that letter, the Leap Day letter of 1952, calls that psychification, which is intensification at the expense of extension.
Okay, I'm going to make James the last one. So are there an almost infinite number of functionally identical universes, seeing as one atom difference is not very different? Sorry for messing that up, James.
Yeah, yes, that's what they're saying. They're saying that the neighboring universes are almost identical, just the position of one quantum particle difference. So there might be an electron in a slightly different point within the depths of some star in some distant galaxy in our parallel universe. Everything would be essentially identical. But when you extrapolate those minute differences out to infinity, then you have every conceivable scenario of history occurring, which makes sense if this is God's mind. Every conceivable possibility and infinite imagination would have no problem working through them all in God's imagination. And the thing that I'll maybe close on is that this multiverse theory helps us unite the opposite extremes of determinism and free will. Anything you want to do, you have an infinite array of possible choices. There's no limit. You can choose to do anything you want to do. But any choice you make freely correlates to some predetermined fixed fate in one of the infinite number of parallel universes. So I might choose to give this class. In another universe, I choose not to give the class. And in all the universes in between, I make ever so slight changes. Then the question becomes, are you the same person in the parallel universe as you are in the one where you choose to do this? That's a good question. And I think that also leads to this inconceivable simultaneous unity and difference of each psyche or each singularity. We're all one, and yet we're all different in some inconceivable way. All singularities are the same because they're all outside of space-time, and they cannot be differentiated by their different points in space and time, and they're structurally identical. They're points of zero volume, and they all contain all of the information of the megaverse of universes. And so therefore, according to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, all singularities are the same, and yet we seem to have different subjective experiences. We're all different. So I guess I'll leave it off with that conundrum for us, that if we are all singularities, we are all one with each other, and yet simultaneously in some inconceivable way, we're all different. That correlates to the Vedanta cosmology established by Chaitanya in the 16th century with the slogan Achintya Beta Beta Tattva. inconceivably simultaneously one and different.
Perfect way to finish. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very quickly, I am going to have to share my screen. So, okay, can you see that, Todd?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Right, so Timothy's talk will be here on the Nightlight speaker series page. If you go to Nightlight Astrology, go to the events page, speaker series, and then this will change from register now to watch again. So you'll be able to see that for 7 days. Timothy has actually said that he will share the slides with you if you are not in one of our year-long classes. So if you have, if you would like the slides, then please email me and then I will get those over to you. So thank you so much. We've had a lot of response in the Q&A. I am really sorry that we haven't had a chance to get through to all of you, but Timothy, you do have a YouTube channel that people can watch a lot of your talks on?
Yep, Todd Desmond is just, that's the name of the channel. TOD-DESMOND, Todd Desmond. If you put in Psyche and Singularity, you'll probably come up to that channel. I go over the book. I have videos of the whole book. Also on that channel, I give a class where I'm talking about how to overcome the fear of death with this information, and you'll be able to see that there also. So it's the hero's journey through philosophy, psychology, and physics is the subtitle of that, and it's at any rate, I go over these same topics in different from different perspectives on that YouTube channel. And Psyche and Singularity is my website also. All those YouTube channel videos are there, and I have a separate YouTube channel.
Perfect. Okay. And the book, do you want to just quickly mention the book?
Yes, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory.
Okay, so there's the website for you all so that you can catch up with Timothy with all of with his book and his videos. And yeah, this has been great. As I say, lots of questions that unfortunately we couldn't get to, but it shows that people were engaged with everything that you were sharing with us and have lots more to ask of you. So we appreciate your time. Thank you for putting so much effort into the talk, because there has been just so much here for everyone. So thank you all. We do have to go now because we have got class, but thank you again, and take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.